For 8 winters, I had been silent in the house of the man whose blood was supposed to be answerable for mine. And on the morning I am going to tell you about, I had decided that today would be the day I broke that silence the only way a marked girl knows how, which is to say with poison. The keep was still asleep when I knelt on the war room flagstones with a bucket of cold water and a rag that had once been somebody's bridal linen. There was a smear of frozen blood on the stone, an old smear, dark and stubborn, near the leg of the council table. I had been told to scrub it out before the bells rang for the morning watch. That was the sort of work they gave me. The sort that begins in the dark and ends before the great hall sees a guest. The sort that says, without anybody having to say it, that the girl who scrubs the floor where men plan murder is not invited to walk on it afterward. My name was Wren. My grandmother had named me for a small singing bird, which was meant as a kindness and turned out, like a great many kindnesses, to be a small private joke that only fate found funny. The bird I was named for was the loudest creature for its size in any forest. But in this keep, I had not used my voice in over 8 years. Not for anyone. Not even to scream when the cuff on my wrist felt as if it had teeth. The cuff was iron. Cold iron. Wrapped over a brand the old Drake had set into my skin, the night his men dragged me out of the burnt yard where my mother had been. The brand was ash. Ashmark, the council called it. I called it nothing because I did not name what owned me. Under the cuff, the mark throbbed in slow time with my pulse, and I had grown so accustomed to that throb that I noticed it only when it stopped, the way you notice a clock when it goes quiet at midnight. So you understand, reader, the shape of my mornings. I scrubbed. I did not look up when the side door opened. I did not look up when boots crossed the stone in the long, unhurried stride of a man who had nothing to prove to a girl on the floor. He was the only one who walked in this keep without armor at this hour. He had been doing it since he was 20 years old, and he was 30 now, and the boots made a sound like patience. "Leave it," he said. It was the first thing he had said directly to me in 3 months. The first since the night I had been sent up to his rooms with a basin and bandages, and had nearly fainted on his threshold because I had thought, after all my careful waiting, that the moment had finally come for me to use the small green vial sewn into the lining of my apron. It had not come that night. He had taken the basin from my hands, set the bandages on a shelf, and dismissed me with a tilt of his head before I had so much as breathed wrong. I had lain awake for hours after, telling myself it had been a kindness. I had stopped believing it was a kindness by dawn. "Leave it," he said again, more softly, and that was when I made my mistake. I looked up. Cassian Vale had silver hair at his temples that none of the women in the village would have believed belonged to a man of 30. The rest of his hair was the color of wet slate. His eyes were the strangest thing about him. The thing no one in the keep could quite stop staring at if he turned them. And the thing no one ever spoke of openly because it was the truth of what he was. They were the color of winter steel before a storm, and when his temper turned on the air, they went a slow, cold blue. They were that blue now, not at me, at the smear on the floor. He crossed to the table and lifted the chair I had been kneeling beside. He set it down 2 paces away. Then he stepped back and gave me room. That was new. I knelt forward again. I scrubbed. I felt him standing behind me with the patience of a man who had inherited a kingdom and was waiting for it to inherit him back. He did not speak. He did not move. After a while, I began to suspect he was watching, not the stain, but the back of my neck. When I had finished, I gathered my rag and my bucket and my apron and bowed, the way you bow when you are not allowed to leave a room before the man inside it dismisses you. He did not dismiss me. Instead, he said one word that I had heard from him perhaps 4 times in 8 years, in this exact, gentle, careful voice. Careful. I lifted my eyes for the second time. I ought you to have. He was looking at the cuff on my wrist. He was looking at it the way a healer looks at a wound that has not been admitted aloud yet. He was looking at it the way you might look at a door behind which you knew a child slept. Then he turned and walked out of the war room. And the boots and the patience and the cold blue eyes were with him. And I knelt on the floor with my bucket and my bridal linen wrap. And I felt, for the second time in 8 years, my ash mark twitch under the cuff in a way that had nothing to do with my pulse. I did not understand it then. I tell you now because by the end of that day I would understand a great many things I had spent 8 years not allowing myself to. The bells rang, the keep woke, and the morning I had chosen to murder its master began, as such mornings often do, with a man telling me to be careful. You have to picture the keep to picture me. It sat on the wind side of a mountain the council called the Spine. We were a clan of dragon bloods on a mountain made of dragon bones. That is what my grandmother had said the night before she stopped saying anything for the last time, and I had been so afraid of what she had said next that I had spent 8 years refusing to remember it. The Great Hall had 3 doors. The first was the guest door. The second was the council door. The third was a small servant door behind a hanging that smelled of soot and old apples, which no one used at all except the women of the kitchens and a girl named Kestrel, who in the entire keep was the only person who had ever spoken to me without expecting silence in answer. Kestrel was waiting for me there now with her arms full of leeks. She was older than me by maybe 2 winters, with hair the color of unwashed linen and freckles on her nose that no amount of soot ever quite hid. She had been brought into the kitchens at 12, the same year I had been brought into the keep. She was a kindly creature and a coward in a particular way, and I had always loved her for both. "Move," she whispered, not unkindly. "There's an envoy, from Southreach, Lord Merrick. They had to dig 3 of his men out of a drift on the 3rd switchback." She pushed the leeks into my chest. "Take these to the cook, and keep your head down. They've been looking at your hair." I knew what she meant. My hair was a problem. My grandmother had had silver white hair from the day she was born. So had her mother and her grandmother. In the high villages, it had meant my line, and meant a kind of warding. And the women who had it had always been bonneted from infancy, so that the wrong sort of eyes did not catch on them and start asking. My hair had been hidden under a coif for as long as I had been in this keep. Under the coif now, against the back of my skull, I felt the wet weight of it. I had washed it last night because tonight I would die or run, and either way I had wanted to be clean. "Go," Kestrel said. I went. "I have to give you Lord Merrick of Southreach in a single picture, because the man does not deserve more than one. He was a tall, well-fed man with a beard like a yew hedge and a habit of speaking through his nose. He sat at the lower end of the high table with his snowed-on cloak still draped over the back of his chair, drinking the Drake's wine. Cassian sat at the head. The Drake's high steward sat at Cassian's right hand. The steward was a small, pale man with eyes the color of pond ice and a mouth that smiled in only one direction. His name was Lord Wren Hollowmere. He had been steward of the keep before Cassian's uncle had died. He had been steward of the keep before Cassian was born. He had been steward of the keep, you understand, for as long as anyone now alive could remember. And that fact was the central fact of this story. Only no one in the Great Hall that morning knew it yet, but him. I came in with a tray of bread. Lord Merrick lifted his eyes from his wine and looked at me as a man looks at a horse in a stall. The look took perhaps 3 seconds. He turned to Cassian and said, in his easy nose voice, "Drake, you've a strange little maid behind your table. Where do you find them with hair like that under the cap?" The steward smiled in his one direction. Cassian did not look at me. He did not move at all. He cut a slice of pear that was on his plate, with the small, bone-handled knife he used for everything that did not have to do with steel, and he set the slice on the rim of his cup. Then he said, "She is not for finding, Marek. She was brought into this keep when I was a boy." Well, the envoy laughed in a low, agreeable way. "A girl is a girl. I would buy her of you for the right ride home through the pass. The Southreach has long winters. I was carrying the bread. You think, listening to me say this now, that I should have flinched, or trembled, or dropped the tray. But you have to understand that I had been called for sale before. I had been called for less. So I did not drop the tray. My hand was steady. My breath was steady. My heart was a quiet animal that had long ago learned not to ask permission. Cassian set down his knife. He did not turn his head. He did not raise his voice. He said, in the same conversational tone you would use to recommend a road, "Merrick, eat your meal, then go." And after a pause that was barely a pause, "And if you speak of my keep's people in my hall again, you will not see your horse in the yard." The envoy laughed, because envoys do laugh at things like that the first time. Then he looked at Cassian's face and stopped laughing. The steward's smile widened in its one direction. I set the bread, I bowed, I left. In the corridor, with the door not quite closed behind me, I leaned against the cold stone and made my breath slow itself by degrees. I could feel my pulse in my cuff, and I thought, in the calm, level voice I used inside my own head, the voice in which I had been telling myself everything I needed to know for 8 years. He has never spoken of me as his keep's people before. He has never spoken of me at all. So now you would also have a question for the master of this house. And now I thought would be a very stupid time to ask it. Because tonight I was going to put a green vial into his cup, and one of us was not going to walk out of the dining hall. The vial had been given to me 2 summers before by a man who had come up the mountain with a cart of salt. He had stopped me in the lower yard where the laundry was hung, and he had said my mother's name, a name I had not heard out of any mouth but my own thoughts since I was 14 years old. He had said it as if it were a password. He had set the small green glass bottle on the post of the laundry line, and he had said, "When you are ready, girl, the old man wants payment. The old man wants payment for your mother's house. You are the only one left who can ask." He had walked away. I had taken the vial. It had lived in the lining of my apron for 2 summers and 1 winter. I knew what it was. I had been a child of a frost singing line, even if I had never been told the word for what that meant. I had grown up on the smell of certain herbs at certain hours. On the way, my grandmother gathered ice off a window pane and folded it into water and gave it to drink to men who had wronged the village in small ways. The vial in my apron was a colder thing than that water. The vial in my apron was the cold that does not break. For 2 summers, I had not used it because I had been waiting for the right night. I had not felt it. What I had felt every time I had stood near Cassian Vale was something else. And the something else was, in fact, why I had decided that today would be the day. Because for 2 summers and 1 winter, I had been telling myself that what I was feeling near him was hatred, slow tightening into resolve. And on the morning I am telling you about, I had finally realized I was lying to myself. It was not hatred. I did not have a name for what it was. I only had the certainty that if I let myself stand near him a single more month, I would not be able to put the vial in his cup. So tonight, I had decided. Whatever this was, whatever it had become, end it before it ends you. I did not know yet that the vial was already useless. I did not know yet that I had been a useful tool in a cleaner game. I did not know yet that the man who had stopped me in the lower yard with my mother's name in his mouth had worked for the steward, not for me. I did not know yet that the vial in my apron had been swapped, very neatly, a week ago, by a person who loved me while I was asleep. These were the things I was going to find out at supper. You ought perhaps to know what an ash mark is. The old Drake, Cassian's uncle, had a habit of marking those he claimed as compensation for fallen debts. When a village owed the keep, and the keep took a girl out of that village for service, the old Drake set a mark on her with a heated iron pressed into ash and salt water. The mark made her his, by the council's reckoning. A cuff was set over the mark so that the mark would not be visible to anyone who might pity her for it. She wore the cuff until either she was sold to another house, married out of service, or she died. I had been marked at 14. The steward had been the man who carried the order down to the village. He had been the man who counted the dead in the yard. The man who pointed at a 14-year-old who had stopped crying earlier than was decent and had said, in his thin, pleased voice, "That one, the one who isn't screaming, mark her and bring her up." I had been 13 and a half. I had stopped screaming because somewhere in the dark behind the burning house, I had heard my grandmother say a word I had never heard before, and the word had taken the screaming out of me and put a silence in its place. I had carried the silence up the mountain on a horse with my hands bound. I had been carrying it ever since. It had a weight, that silence, like a stone in the lung. I want to tell you about a thing that happened in the afternoon, because if I do not tell you about it, I will not be able to make you understand what happened at supper. I had been sent up to bring a clean bandage to Cassian's rooms. He had cut his forearm on a boar's broken tooth in the morning yard and had thought less of it. By afternoon, the cut had decided to think on its own and was bleeding through his sleeve. The keep's healer was at a calving down in the lower village. The steward sent the bandages up. The steward sent me up to carry them. He sent me. He had not sent me up in 8 years, not once. He stood in the kitchen passage when he gave the orders to Kestrel, and his eyes went over me as if he were checking the level on a cask. He smiled in his one direction. He said, mild as butter, "The Drake is asking for clean linen. The Wraith girl can take it." Kestrel had folded the linen and pressed it into my hand, and her fingers had been cold. She had whispered, when the steward had turned away, "Don't be alone with him. Be quick." I had thought she had meant Cassian. "I am going to tell you now, plainly, so we do not have to circle it." She had not meant Cassian. She had meant the steward. I climbed the stair. I knocked. He bade me in. His chambers were not as I had imagined them. They were plain. A pallet bed, an old chair, a tall window with a wooden shutter latched against the wind, a chest at the foot of the bed, a sword in a stand by the door. The room smelled of cedar and a particular kind of cold, dry smoke I had not smelled since my grandmother's house had burned. It smelled, to put it shortly, like a man whose body had decided, by some old joke of blood, to smell like a thing I had once been safe in. I went very still in the doorway. He was in the washroom off the bedchamber, sitting on the low stool by the basin. His shirt was off because he could not have unwrapped the sleeve over the cut without ruining the shirt. He had a folded cloth pressed to his forearm, and the cloth was already dark. He did not look at me when I came in. He spoke to a point above the basin. "Set the linen on the chest, then go." I set the linen on the chest. I did not go. He turned his head. He looked at me. He waited. I had not raised my eyes to him twice in one day in 8 years. I had now done it 3 times. "Wren," he said. Just the name. The way a man might say it under his breath when there was no one in the room to hear. His voice had no heat in it. There was nothing in it but a particular kind of recognition. The kind a man uses when he names a thing in his own house that he has been pretending all morning is not there. I did not move. He said more carefully, "Go down, Wren. Send Kestrel up. I'll have her do this." I should have. I did not. I crossed the room. I took the cloth from his forearm. The cut was long but not deep. I had bandaged worse on goats. I lifted his arm so that the light from the small window caught the wound. I reached for the clean linen. He watched me. He did not move his arm. The skin under my fingers was warm. The cut was tacky. The muscle under the skin was a fact you could not be casual about. I knelt on the stone by the stool, and I lifted his forearm onto my lap. And I cleaned the cut with vinegar and water, and I wound the linen in 3 even loops, and tied it off in the old way. The village women had tied off bandages on goats, and on children, with a flat knot that did not gnaw at the skin. When I had finished, I sat back on my heels. He had not stopped watching me. I lifted my eyes. It was the 4th time that day, and it was the time that did it. His eyes had gone the cold blue I had seen in the war room at dawn, only this time the blue was different. The blue was for me. I knew the way an animal knows a hand near its ear. I knew because the small warm place under my cuff went, for a single beat, hot. He saw the heat hit my face. His own face, in the same beat, did a thing I had not seen it do before. The mouth, which I had always thought of as a flat, shut line, opened slightly. Then it closed. He breathed out slowly, with effort, the way a man breathes out when he has just told himself something firmly and is making sure the rest of him agreed. He said, "Your wrist." I did not understand. He said more softly, "Your wrist, Wren." The cuff. I felt the cuff at the same moment he said it. I felt the cuff burn. It was not a deep burn. It was the heat that you would feel if you held your hand a hair too near a kettle. I jerked my hand back from his forearm. The cuff scraped against the linen on his wrist as I drew away. Where the cuff scraped, a thin line of blue light, pale as the first ice on standing water, flared along the metal. I saw it. He saw me see it. And in the way of all old paired things, the light answered itself in the other body in the room. Along the inside of his bare forearm, where I had laid my fingers a breath before, a corresponding line of the same blue light bloomed up out of the skin, traced an old shape there, older than the council, older than the keep, older, very nearly, than the mountain, and went out. The room was silent. Then he said, in the smallest voice I had ever heard him use, "Get up, go down. Do not come up the stair tonight, Wren. Do not come up the stair for anyone. Do you hear me?" I heard him. I went down the stair. In the corridor outside his chambers, with my back pressed against the cold wall and my breath stuttering in my throat, I held my right wrist in my left hand, and I felt my cuff cool, by degrees, by long degrees, the way a kettle cools an hour after the fire is out. And the silence in my chest, The great stone silence I had been carrying for 8 years took its first uneven breath. I went down. I did as he had said. I did not go up the stair that night for anybody. I went instead to the lower archive. The lower archive of the keep was a room that nobody used because the wind off the eastern pass came down a flue right above the records and made any candle you set there gutter every quarter hour. I went down to it because I had been told 4 months ago by an old kitchen woman who had since died of a winter cough that there was a ledger in that archive that listed every girl who had ever come into the keep under the council's compensation order. The kitchen woman had told me, the night she had died, that she had once seen the ledger open on a table in the Great Hall, and that the name above mine, in the ledger, was not a village name. It was a hand name, a man's signed name. Somebody had bought me into the keep 2 years before I had been brought. Somebody had asked for me by my name. I had not been able to believe that. I had been afraid to look. I was not afraid that evening. I had seen a blue line of light bloom up out of a man's forearm where my fingers had been. And a girl who has seen that does not run out of fear for several hours. She runs out of other things instead. The archive was cold. The candle guttered. I pulled the ledger for the year I had been brought. I set it on the table. I unlatched the brass clasp. I knew, before I opened it, what I was going to see. I had prepared myself to see Wren Hollomir's signed name above my own, in a clerkly hand, with a sum next to it and the word compensation in the margin. The name above my own was not Wren Hollomir's. It was not in the steward's clerkly hand. It was in another hand, a hand I had seen on a single piece of paper before, on a writ ordering the village laundry tax forgiven the year I had been 16. It was a hand I had not let myself think about in 2 years. The name was Cassian Vale. The sum was nothing. The word in the margin was not compensation. The word in the margin was protection. I closed the ledger. I sat in the cold archive with the candle guttering for a long time. The wind off the pass came down the flue and went out my candle. I did not relight it. I sat in the dark with the ledger under my hand, and I let the cuff on my right wrist throb against the wood. The old level voice in my head, the voice I had been trusting for 8 years, said, "He has bought you." The voice said, "You are a thing on a list." The voice said, "The word in the margin is a lie because men who own you write the word that pleases them." The voice said, "Tonight, then." You meant tonight anyway. Tonight, then. The voice was the loudest it had been in 8 years. It was also, I realized, somebody else's voice. It had always been somebody else's voice. It was the voice of the man who had stopped me in the lower yard with my mother's name. It was the voice of the man who had given me the vial. It was not my voice. I sat in the dark for another long while. I waited for my own voice to come up to me. It did not come. I had not let it speak in 8 years. It came near. It hovered. I could feel it at the edge of the silent stone in my chest. It was small. It was, I thought, the size of a finger. I could not yet make it say anything. But I made it a promise. I promised I would not pour the vial. Not yet. Not tonight. I would carry it down to supper. I would set it under my plate. I would sit in the corner of the lower hall where the Wraith girl was permitted to sit. I would watch. That was my plan. It would survive the soup. It would not survive the wine. The lower hall at supper was 3 things at once: a kitchen, an antechamber, and the place where the keep's people who were not council ate their bread and minded their tongues. The high table was up a flight of 3 steps, behind a long curtain that they only drew when there was diplomacy in the air. On the night I am telling you about, the curtain was open. I sat in the corner. Kestrel sat with me. She had washed her hands. Her freckles in the lamplight looked almost orderly. She did not look at me when I sat down. She looked at her bowl. I had not, in our 2 summers and 1 winter together, ever known Kestrel to refuse to look at me. I said nothing. The new small voice in my chest was still the size of a finger and was not as yet willing to come up my throat. I ate my soup with my left hand. My right hand stayed under the table, in the lining of my apron, around the green vial. Above us, on the high steps, Lord Merrick was telling a long, agreeable story about a horse race he had bet badly on at the spring fair in Southreach. Cassian listened with his face set the way you set a door against a wind. He did not eat. He had set his goblet down at the start of the meal, half full, and he had not touched it since. The steward at his right hand was eating with both hands, which I had not seen him do in 8 years. The steward also was watching Cassian's goblet. He was watching it with the particular long, sideways attention of a man waiting for a kettle. I looked at Kestrel. Kestrel did not look at me. I looked at the goblet. I felt, in the meat of my chest under my smock, a small, cold, seasick lurch. It was not the cuff. It was older than the cuff. It was the thing my grandmother had called in the village, the warning under the heart. I put my spoon down. I leaned, very slightly, against Kestrel, hard enough for her to know that I was asking. She drew a breath. She did not turn her head. She said very quietly, almost into her bowl, "I switched it 3 weeks ago. He told me to. The green is sugar water now. Wren, I am so sorry. He told me to." I closed my fingers around the vial in my apron. Above us, on the steps, Cassian lifted his goblet. Time did the thing time does. When you have just been told a thing you have been preparing for 2 summers to use as a key, and the key turns out to be a piece of dried bread. I saw the lift of his hand to the goblet, the small turn of his wrist, the angle of his elbow. I saw his lips part. I saw him drink. I saw his throat work. I saw him set the goblet down. I saw the steward, at his right hand, smile in his one direction. I have never been certain what the wine in that goblet was. What the steward had thought was in Cassian's wine. What the steward had been waiting for. What the steward had spent his afternoon arranging. Those were all things the steward had arranged on his own. What I know is that Cassian set down the goblet and his face did not change. He did not gasp. He did not stiffen. He turned his head slightly toward the steward, the way you turn your head toward a sound you have just decided you have heard. And he said, in his ordinary mild voice, "Wren, walk a moment with me." The steward's smile broke at one edge, only at one edge. He set down his bread. He rose. He said mildly back, "Of course, my lord." Cassian rose. Below me, in the lower hall, I rose. I did not mean to. I did it before my body asked permission. Cassian turned his head, looking for me as if he had been measuring my whereabouts in the room all evening. And his eyes found me at exactly the angle they had to find me. And he said, across the great hall in front of everyone, in a voice he had been keeping in reserve for 8 years, my name. Wren. The keep heard it. The hall heard it. Lord Merrick's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. I felt the cuff on my wrist heat. This time not warm, not hot, but a clean, cold blue. I felt it the way you would feel a hand close around your wrist from the other side of a wall. I lifted my eyes to the high table. Cassian was looking at me. His face was the face of a man who had had a long borrowed thing in his cup and had drunk it because he had been watching for it for a long time and had at last seen it offered and had taken it and had not, even for a single beat, taken his attention off the girl in the corner of the lower hall while he had done so. He said, "Come up the steps, Wren." I went up the steps. I do not exactly remember how I went up the steps. I remember the wood under my soles. I remember the smell of the lamps. I remember that Kestrel did not rise behind me. I remember that Lord Merrick of all people stood up halfway as I passed him. I remember that I did not look at the steward. I came to the top. I stopped a pace short of Cassian. He said, looking only at me, "What did you put in my cup, Wren?" I shook my head once. I had nothing to say. He said gentler, "The vial." I lifted my apron. I took the vial out of the lining. I held it on my palm. I held my palm out toward him, the way a child holds a dead bird. He took the vial. He held it up to the candle. He smiled. It was a small, awful, tired smile. And it was the first smile I had seen on his face in 8 years. "Sugar water," he said. "It would have been sugar water for 2 months, Wren." Kestrel changed it for me. I was going to tell you. Not in a hall, not at a table. I looked at the steward. I looked at the steward, and the steward looked back at me, and the steward's smile did not break this time at any edge. The steward's smile held because the steward had not yet understood what had happened. The steward had thought that something had been put into the drake's wine that the drake had drunk. The steward had been waiting all evening for the drake to fall. The steward did not yet know what we two on the steps knew, because we two on the steps had been on the steps with each other for 8 years without ever having shared a step. We knew nothing had been put in the wine. We knew Cassian had drunk plain wine. We knew the vial was sugar water, and had been sugar water for 2 months. We knew the steward had spent his afternoon arranging an empty kettle. The steward held his smile. Cassian set the green vial down on the edge of the high table. Very carefully, the way you set down an instrument you do not want to break. He turned to the steward. He said in the conversational tone you would use to recommend a road, "Wren, walk with me, please. Now." He walked the steward out of the hall the way you walk an old dog out of a sick room. The hall did not move. The hall did not breathe. Then Lord Merrick of Southreach lowered himself slowly back into his chair, lifted his spoon, said, to no one in particular, "Drake's Keep," like a man who has decided he has seen something he is not going to mention to his wife, and applied himself to his bowl. Captain Halrick came up beside me. He took the green vial off the table. He pocketed it. He said, gently, "Sit down at the high table, lass. You're white as paper." I sat at the high table. I had been on the floor of it that morning, scrubbing somebody else's blood, and I sat at it that night, white as paper, and the new small voice in my chest had not yet learned how to make a sound, but it had grown in the last 3 minutes to a size that I could no longer ignore. It was the size of a swallow. It was, I thought, going to try to fly soon. I was not yet sure if I would let it. He came back without the steward. He came back with snow on the shoulders of his coat from where he had walked the man across the courtyard. He came back with his face arranged. He sat at the head of the high table again, and he picked up his goblet, and he set it back down without drinking. He said to the hall, level, "The steward is unwell. He is in his rooms." The hall murmured politely. He said, "Lord Merrick, forgive me. Eat, sleep. I shall see you at the gate in the morning." Lord Merrick bowed his head over his soup and did not, very wisely, lift it again until the Drake of the Keep had risen from the high table and had crossed to me and had offered me his hand. I had not, in 8 years in the Keep, been offered a hand. I rose without taking it. The small voice in my chest would not let me take anything from anyone in front of a hall I had been Wraith Girl in. The voice was very particular about this. It was the first thing the voice had ever told me to do, and I obeyed it. Cassian saw. Cassian, of all the people in the hall, saw what the not taking of the hand was. He let his hand fall. He gave me the smallest nod I have ever been given. He said, "Lo, walk with me, please, Wren." I walked with him. We went out of the great hall through the council door. He led me to a small room at the back of the council passage that I had not, in 8 years, been allowed into. It had a fire in it. There were 2 chairs. There was a small table with a map weighed down by an empty teacup. He shut the door. He turned to face me with his back to the door, which was, I noticed, the way you stand if you are afraid the person in the room with you will run. He said, "Sit, Wren." I sat. The chair was warm. The fire had been laid recently. The room had been heated for someone. I understood, in a slow, honest way, that the room had been heated for me. He had been ready for me for a long time. He sat in the chair across from mine. He folded his hands on his lap. He did not look anywhere except at my face. I had not been looked at like that since my mother had looked at me, the morning of the burning, with my hand on the latch of our door and her hand on top of mine. He said, "I am going to say a number of things to you in the next half hour, Wren. I am going to say them quickly. You may not like the order. I beg you to listen to all of them before you decide what to do." I nodded. Once, he said, "First, my uncle the old Drake did not burn your village. He was given that order. He did not give it. The order was written under his seal by the man you just watched me walk out of the Great Hall. My uncle died 3 months after your village burned, of a cup of wine that was not plain. I did not know this when I was 20. I learned it the year I was 26. I have been preparing to take Wren Hollowmere off the back of this keep ever since. I did not move." He said, "Second, I bought you out of the lower yard the year I was 28. I bought you on paper, the same paper the council uses for any Wraith Girl, with the word protection in the margin where the word compensation usually goes. I had learned, in the second of the years I was preparing for the steward, the name of the village he had burned. It was your grandmother's village. It was my grandmother's village, also 3 generations back. I was raised on her stories. I knew, when I learned the name, that there would still be a child of the line in the lower yard somewhere in the keep, because Hollowmere keeps his trophies where he can see them. I had you brought up to the kitchen. I asked Kestrel to keep you close. I have been keeping you alive without speaking to you for 2 years, Wren, because if I had ever once turned my head in your direction in a way the steward could see, he would have arranged for you to die quietly, the way my uncle died quietly. And I have already lost an uncle to that man. He paused. He said, "Third. The cuff on your wrist is not the cuff the old Drake's armorer set on you the morning after the burning. The cuff on your wrist now is one I had made for you 4 years ago. It looks the same. It weighs the same. It was set on you the night you came down with the lung fever and slept 3 days in the kitchen, and Kestrel sat by you. The cuff I had made will come off your wrist the moment you say a word that is your own. It does not need a key. It needs your voice. That is all it has ever needed." I lifted my right hand. I looked at the cuff. It looked in the firelight like a length of cold iron with a plain hinge. I thought, in the small new voice that had grown swallow-sized, "He is telling me I can take it off." He said, "Fourth, the steward had laid traps under the use of that vial. The steward had paid a man up from the South Pass to give you the vial and to come back, in a certain week, to confirm that you had used it. The steward had a story ready. Wren, the story was that you had poisoned me. The story was that you had been a Frost singer all along and you had crept up into the high table and put a green vial in my wine. And that he, the steward, had been the only man in the keep with the foresight to suspect you. The story would have ended in a fire in the lower yard. The fire would have ended the line your grandmother sealed into your hand." He stopped. He said, "Last, I am sorry, Wren. I am sorry I let you scrub the floor this morning. I am sorry I let you carry the bread for Merrick this afternoon. I am sorry I have not put my hand under your elbow in 2 years. I have been protecting you in the only way the steward would not see, and the only way I knew. And it has cost you 8 years of silence, and I am sorry. I will say it for the rest of my life if you want me to say it. But before I say it again, you have to know one more thing. Because if you do not know it, you will not know what to choose." I looked up. He said, "My mother is bound to him." I did not understand. He said, "My mother, Marsa Vale. She is bound to the steward by an old oath that he forced on her when I was 8 years old. The oath sits in a chain in his rooms. The chain is in truth a binding thing the council outlawed 3 centuries ago. While he wears the binding, my mother lives only at his sufferance. If I move openly against him before the Frostfall ceremony, the binding breaks her. If I claim a mate openly in his hall before the binding is undone, the binding breaks her. I have spent 10 years finding the binding's flaw. I have not yet found it, so I have not moved against him openly. I have not claimed openly. I have not." Wren, his voice did not break, but it bent. "I have not looked at you in front of him in 2 years, because if I had, he would have taken you in front of me to make my mother kneel." He stopped. He waited. I sat in the warm room with my right hand on my left forearm and my left hand on my mouth, and the small hawk voice under my collarbone trying to get up the back of my throat. I lifted my left hand off my mouth. I tried for the first time in 8 years to say a word out loud. Nothing came. I shook my head. I tried again. Nothing came. His face did the smallest, kindest thing it had ever done. The eyes went a different blue than the war blue. He shook his head back at me. He said, "Not tonight. You don't have to tonight. I did not bring you in here to make you speak. I brought you in here because I needed you to know." He stood up. He said, "I will walk you back to the kitchen. Kestrel will sit with you. You are not to be alone tonight. If you cannot sleep, send word, and I will sit outside the kitchen door until the bells." He held out his hand. I took it. I do not know, even now, why I took it. I had not taken his hand on the steps in front of the hall. I took it in the warm, small room behind the council door. I took it and his palm closed around mine, and where my cuff brushed the inside of his wrist, a soft, cold blue line bloomed and went out, the way candle smoke blooms and goes out, and we both saw it, and neither of us said anything about it, because we had both spent the day saying enough things. He walked me down to the kitchen. Kestrel was sitting on a stool by the hearth, with her hands twisted in her apron and her face wet. She rose. She looked at me. I looked at her. I did not have a voice for her. I crossed the kitchen and I put my arms around her and I held her. And after a moment she held me back, and I let her cry into my shoulder, because the night had asked a great deal of her. and a great deal more than it had asked of me. And the small hawk voice in my chest understood that, and the small hawk voice was, I realized, growing kinder as it grew. Cassian stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. Then he closed the door, and the kitchen was ours. The night went on. I lay on my back with my right hand over my left wrist and my left hand on the cuff, and I listened to the kitchen settle. I listened, very faintly, to a man's boots in the corridor outside, walking up and down at the slow, patient pace of a man who had said he would sit outside a door until the bells. I did not go to him. The small hawk voice in my chest had grown again. It was the size of a goose now. It was up under my collarbone and pressing hard against my throat, and I could not, even alone in the dark, make it come up out of my mouth as sound. I could only make it bend my breath. At some hour before dawn, I tried, finally, to say his name. Nothing came. I tried to say my own. Nothing came. So I slept, finally, with the goose voice pressed up under my chin like an animal that had found the warm place in me by my pulse and had decided to sleep there too. She came down to the kitchen the next morning, the Lady Marsa Vale, in a plain wool coat with the hood up, the way the women of the keep came down to the kitchen when they did not want the corridor to notice them. I had never, in 8 years, been spoken to by the Drake's mother. I had passed her in the upper gallery once a year, on the feast of the long night, when she had walked behind her son to the chapel, and I had bowed, and she had not looked at me, because looking at the wraith girl in the corridor was a thing the Drake's mother was not permitted to do without a price. She came down to the kitchen. She set her hood back. Her hair, in the kitchen's morning light, was the same wet slate as her son's, threaded with one slow streak of silver above her left temple. She had her son's mouth. She said, Wren. I rose from the kitchen bench. I bowed. She said, Sit down, child. I am not the council. I have come to bring you a thing my son will not bring you, because he is, as I have told him every winter of his life, a man who learned to keep all of his hands in his pockets and one of his hearts in a drawer. She put a small parcel on the table between us. It was wrapped in a square of linen. She did not open it. I did not open it. She said, I have known you were in this keep since the night you came up the mountain on the back of a horse with your hands tied. I have known what was set on your wrist. I have known the shape of the brand under the iron. I have known whose hand pointed at you in the yard. I have known these things, and I have done nothing about any of them for 8 years, Wren, because my son was 8 years old once, in the upper gallery, with a chain at his throat that did not look like a chain to him then, and I made an oath that day to keep my hands in my own pockets if it would keep him from having to do the same. It did not. He has kept them anyway because he is his father's son and because he is also, as it turns out, my son. And I am sorry, Wren. I am sorry for every morning of 8 winters. She sat down on the bench opposite mine. She said, Quieter, I have come to tell you that what you cannot say with your mouth, you may say with your hand. He gave you a small stone bird. I gave it to him when he was 9. It came out of a wall my mother's mother set the stone of. It will answer a daughter of the line who is willing to lay her hand under it and tell the room, with her hand, what her mouth has not yet learned. It does not need a song, Wren. It needs only your honest hand. Do you understand? I did not say I understood. I bowed. She set her own hand, briefly, on top of mine on the table. Her hand was warm. Her hand had no rings. Her hand had one small ash-marked scar on the inside of her wrist that I had not been close enough to see in 8 years. She rose. She put her hood back up. She walked out of the kitchen. I sat on the bench with the linen parcel between my palms. I did not open it. I did not need to. The size of the parcel and the weight of the parcel told me what the parcel was, and the parcel told me what the morning told me, which was that the women of the keep, even the women I had never been spoken to by, had been counting my mornings with their own ledgers, and that I had not, after all, been carrying my silence alone. The new voice in my chest grew. In the warm kitchen, a small wing. It was, I understood, not far now. The morning we lost the laundry shed was the morning of the 3rd day before the Frostfall ceremony. I went down to it after the dawn bells with an armful of altar linens. I crossed the yard with the linens in my arms. I lifted the leather curtain. I went in. The steward was in the shed. He was sitting on one of the oak vats with his ankles crossed and his small, pale hands folded in his lap. He smiled in his one direction. He looked in the gray morning light, exactly as he had looked at the high table the night before, except that one corner of his collar had broken loose from his outer coat, and he had not adjusted it. "Wraith girl," he said. I stopped in the doorway. He said, "Close the curtain, child. There's a wind." I did not move. He stood. He came across the shed. He drew the leather curtain closed behind me, and he turned. And he set his palm against the latch of the curtain so that I could not, without going through him, open it again. He said, "He told you then, about the binding." I did not answer. He said, "I thought he would, eventually. 2 years is a long time to walk past a girl in your own kitchen." He always was sentimental. His uncle was sentimental too. It was the chief difficulty of the old man. He stepped closer. I stepped back. He stepped closer. I stepped back again. He stepped closer a third time. I will not pretend in this telling that I was brave in the shed. I had a goose voice in my throat and an armful of altar linens and a cuff that ached under its iron. And the most useful thing in the world to me at that moment would have been a voice I had not yet been able to make. And the steward knew this. The steward had spent 8 years arranging this. He raised his hand. He had a small leather pouch in it. He opened it. The dust was dull gray. It was the color of old iron, ground fine. I knew what it was before I saw it. Every woman in my grandmother's line has been told, before her 10th winter, what cold iron dust does to a frost-singing throat. The dust does not kill. The dust does not bind. The dust does only one thing, and it does it permanently. It locks the throat for any working of the old song. It does not lock you out of human speech. It locks you out of magic. He threw the dust. I did not duck. There was no room to duck. I closed my mouth on instinct. I closed my eyes. The dust hit my face. I felt it on my eyelids. I felt some of it, in spite of my closed mouth, on the wet inside of my lower lip, where the lip line meets the gum. He stepped back. He said, "Now sing, Wraith Girl. Sing on the steps of the Frostfall ceremony. Sing in the great hall with the drake watching. Sing the binding off his mother. Sing it." "I'll wait." I lifted the altar linens up against my face. I scrubbed at my mouth. The dust did not come out easily. I scrubbed until my lip was raw. I did not cry. I had not let myself cry in 8 years, and I had no intention of starting in front of him. He watched me. He smiled in his one direction. He said, "I will see you at the ceremony, child. Sit at the lower bench. Be quiet. Be the Wraith Girl. You have been good at it for 8 years. Be good at it a single morning more. After the ceremony, when the drake has knelt to me and my chain has gone around his neck because his mother's life will hang from the other end of it, I will be merciful. I will sell you down to Southreach. Marek will pay well. He has always wanted a girl with hair like that." He went out under the curtain. I sat down on the stone floor with the altar linens around me. The goose voice under my collarbone went very still. It went still the way an animal goes still when it has, in the dark, smelled something larger than itself. It did not panic. It did not flutter. It did not die. It went still and it waited. After a long while, Kestrel found me. She knelt on the stone beside me. She took my face in her hands. She wiped very gently with the cuff of her sleeve at the wet inside of my lower lip where the dust had got past my teeth, and she said, "Oh, Wren! Oh, Wren! Oh!" I tried while she wept to say her name. Nothing came. But the goose voice in my chest was not gone. The goose voice was waiting. The goose voice I understood was not the frost song. The goose voice was something else. The goose voice was mine. Cassian was told by Kestrel what had happened in the shed. Cassian did not, when he was told, break a chair or a table or his own hand. Cassian, when he was told, sat down on a stool in the kitchen and put his palms on his thighs and looked at the wall for the length of one long breath. And then he stood up and he said to Kestrel, very quietly, "She will speak. We will not need the song. Stay with her. I will be on the wall." He went up to the wall. He spent the day on the wall. He sent me only one thing in the long day. He sent me by a runner a folded square of soft linen with no message in it. The linen had been wrapped, before it was folded, around a small carved thing of pale stone. The thing of pale stone was a bird. It had wings folded along its back and a small open beak. It was no longer than the joint of my smallest finger. It was, I realized when I unfolded it on the kitchen table, the small singing bird I was named for. It said without saying, he had not in 8 years sent me anything. He was, I realized, sitting on the wall in the cold, asking me by means of a stone wren to do, on the steps of the Frostfall ceremony, the thing he could not do for me. He was, I realized, asking me to speak. I put the stone wren in my apron, where the vial had used to live. I sat down on the kitchen bench. I drew a long breath. The goose voice in my chest moved. It moved up. It moved up under my throat. It pressed against the dust on the wet inside of my lower lip. It pressed up against my closed teeth. It pressed up against the cuff on my right wrist, where the cuff was warm against my pulse. It pressed. It did not, yet, come out. But it moved. That was enough for that day. The morning of the Frostfall ceremony came up gray and very cold. The keep had been polished for 2 days. The council came in by the long stair, in their robes and their hoods, with their hands tucked into their sleeves against the wind. They sat in a half-circle in the great hall on the high steps. The steward sat at one end of the half-circle, in his steward's chair. Cassian sat at the other, in the drake's chair. His mother, Marsa Vale, sat between them. She was a tall, thin woman with the same wet slate hair as her son. Her hands were folded on her lap. Her face was the face of a woman who had been told at breakfast that her life would be a thing on a table by sundown, and had decided over her bread that she would not weep about it. I sat at the lower bench. I sat with Kestrel. I sat with my hands in my lap. I sat with the stone wren in my apron. I sat with the goose voice up under my collarbone. Very still, very quiet, very ready. The steward rose. He said in the thin, pleased voice he had used in the lower yard the morning of the burning, "Council, we are gathered for the Frostfall. Before fealty is sworn, this steward must lay before you a matter of the keep's safety. We have, sheltered in our walls, a daughter of the old frost-singing line. We have her with the drake's knowledge. We have her, in fact, with the drake's protection." The council murmured. He said, "I bring a witness." He brought the witness. The witness was a small old man with a brown coat and a brown beard, and he had been paid, you understand, but the coin was not in the coat. He stood in the center of the half-circle and he said, in a voice that was not his own, that he had been a goatherd in my village the night of the burning, and that he had seen, with his own eyes, a girl of 14 with white hair set a torch to her own father's roof. The council murmured louder. The steward smiled in his one direction. He turned to Cassian. He said, "Drake, the keep cannot harbor her. Hand her down." Or I read out, "Here, before this council, the binding I hold on the lady your mother." He drew from inside his coat a thin chain of black links. He held it up. The chain caught the light off the great hall's high windows. The chain was, you have to understand, not a chain. The chain was the binding thing the council had outlawed 3 centuries ago and had then, in the way of councils, forgotten it had outlawed. The council recognized it. The council went still. Marsa Vale did not move. Cassian rose. He said in the conversational tone you would use to recommend a road, "Wren, put the chain down." The steward did not. Cassian said, "I am claiming her." The hall drew in a single breath. The steward laughed, and the laugh was the first thing in 8 years I had heard come out of his mouth that was not in his one direction. The laugh was honest. "Claim her then," he said. "Claim her openly here, and we shall see what your mother's throat does in the next 3 breaths." Cassian moved. He moved toward the chain. I rose. I rose without meaning to. I rose the way I had risen at supper, in front of my own body's permission. I stepped out from the lower bench, and I crossed the floor between the lower bench and the high steps, and I put myself between Cassian and the steward, between the drake and the chain, between my mate and the binding on his mother. I stood in the space where the council could see me, and the council saw me, and the steward saw me, and Cassian behind me stopped. The steward said, "Gentle wraith girl, sing." I did not sing. I could not sing. I knew it. He knew it. Every soul in the hall who had been told what cold iron dust does to a frost-singing throat knew it. I lifted my chin. I drew breath. The goose voice in my throat rose. It rose up off my collarbone. It rose up past my teeth. It rose up to the seal of my lips. It pressed. I opened my mouth. I said, in the small first sound I had made in 8 years, in a voice that was nothing like my grandmother's, and nothing like my mother's, and nothing like any voice the keep had ever heard out of me. A voice that was small and shaking and entirely my own. He set the fire. The hall heard it. The steward's face did not change, not yet. He was a man whose face did not change for small things. I said louder. He gave the order. He carried it down. He marked me afterward. He stood in my yard. I was 13. I was 13 and a half. He pointed at me. He said, that one, the one who isn't screaming. He marked me with his own hand. He brought me up the mountain on a horse with my hands bound. He has been the steward of this keep for 8 years longer than he should have been. He killed the old drake with a cup of wine. He has held the Lady Marsa under a chain for 10 years. He paid the man in the coat. He paid him last week. The coin is not in the coat. The coin is in the man's boot. The man in the coat dropped his eyes. The council saw the eyes drop. The steward turned his head very slightly toward the man in the coat. The man in the coat, in the most useful thing he did for me in his small, useful life, reached down with shaking fingers and took off his right boot and turned it upside down on the floor of the great hall. And 3 small gold coins fell out of it onto the stone and lay there in front of the council and rolled to a stop. The hall said nothing. The steward's face changed. It changed in only one place. The corner of his smile, the one corner that had not broken at the table the night before, broke now. He lifted the black chain. He said, low and sweet, sing it off her then, Frost Singer, if you have a voice. Or your drake's mother will be a body on this floor before the council can stand. I did not sing. I had no song. The dust had taken the song. The dust would never give the song back. What I had was a goose voice in my throat, raw with the rasp of 8 years of not being used, hoarse from the dust, small and shaking and human. What I had was the truth. What I had was, in the lining of my apron, a small stone wren no longer than my smallest finger's joint. I took the stone wren out of my apron. I held it in my open palm. I lifted my palm toward Marsa Vale. I said, in my hoarse, small human voice, looking at her and not at the steward, "Lady, stand." She stood. She stood because a daughter of the line had named her to. She stood because the small carved bird in my hand was carved out of a stone the steward did not know the name of, and the stone had been quarried 3 generations back from a mountain my grandmother had once told me would answer a granddaughter of the line if a granddaughter of the line ever asked it to in her own voice. She stood because 8 years of silence had ended in the only word I had needed to say, which was, stand. The chain in the steward's hand cracked once down its middle. It did not break open. It cracked. A thin line of cold light ran down the middle of every black link. The light was the blue I had seen on Cassian's forearm in the washroom. The light was the blue I had seen on my cuff in the warm, small room. The light was the blue that had been waiting 8 years for a granddaughter of the line to use her ordinary human voice to do something with her name in her own mouth. The steward's face, for the first time in his long life, did the thing other men's faces did. It went white. He let go of the chain. The chain hit the stone floor. The chain came apart on the stone floor in 8 links, which is to say 1 link for each year he had held the Lady Marsa under it, and the council watched, and the council did not move, and the council, after a long moment, turned its heads as a council turns its head, and looked, not at me, not at Cassian, not at Marsa Vale, but at the steward of the keep. He had nowhere to go. Captain Halrick came down the half-circle on the council's blind side and laid his hand on the steward's shoulder very gently, the way you lay a hand on an old dog you mean to walk out of a sick room, and walked him out of the hall. The steward did not resist. Stewards rarely do, when there is nothing left to be steward of. The cuff on my right wrist clicked open. It fell off. It hit the stone with the small, clear sound of iron that has at last been allowed to stop pretending. Cassian stepped forward. He stopped 1 pace short of me. He looked at me. The blue I had not had a name for, in the warm, small room behind the council door, came up in his eyes. I had a name for it now. The name was, at last. He went down on one knee on the stone of the great hall in front of the council, and in front of his mother, and in front of every soul in the keep who had ever walked past the wraith girl in the corridor and not looked twice, and he held out his hand, palm up, the way men of his blood have held out their hands to women of mine for as long as either line has remembered the other. He said in a voice that was not, this time, mild, Wren. Choose. I put my hand in his. The blue light bloomed up between our palms and held. The hall, finally, breathed. We were claimed under the open sky an hour later, on the wall above the eastern pass, where the wind off the mountain came up clean and very cold, and the great houses of the council stood in a half-circle behind us, in their robes and their hoods. There was no chain. There were no oaths. There was a small old priestess up from the lower village with a bowl of water and a folded cloth, and there was Marsa Vale in a coat lent her by Kestrel, and there was Captain Halric, and there was Kestrel herself, with her hands in her apron and her freckles, in the open sun off the snow, no longer hidden by soot. Cassian set a thin band of white iron around my wrist where the cuff had been. It was not a cuff. It was a circle. It had no hinge. It had no key. It had the same blue light running through it that had run between our palms in the great hall. He said, "Into the wind." The words an old drake says into the wind when he has chosen. And the wind took them up the mountain and gave them back to us. And the old priestess set her hand on my head and said something my grandmother had said over me when I was very small. And the small hawk voice in my chest, which was a hawk voice now and not a goose, lifted up and out, and answered the wind with the only true human word I had said in 8 years and 7 days. Yes, the steward was tried by the council. He was tried in his own steward's chair with the council in their half-circle and the gold coins on the table in front of him. And he did not speak much. He had nothing left to say. The council took the keep seal off him at the end of the 3rd day. They walked him down the mountain in a wagon. He died of a winter cough 2 summers later in a cottage in the lowlands, attended by a single goatherd who had been paid by Marsa Vale to be kind to him. He had not been kind to many people. Marsa Vale was the kind sort. The old drake's reputation was restored. In the small, dry way the council restores reputations, with a paragraph in a book no one reads. It mattered, anyway, to Cassian. The villages of the eastern pass were sent grain that winter, in carts, with my name on the bill of lading, because Cassian had decided, without asking me, that the lower villages would know who had sent the carts. I let him. I had decided I would let him do small, useful kindnesses on my behalf, in public, because 8 years of his hidden ones had given him the right. Kestrel married, the following spring, a quiet baker from the lower village who had been writing her letters for 2 years without her knowing. She came up to see me once a month. She brought bread. It was spring of the 2nd year that our daughter was born. We named her Celine, for my mother, who had not lived to be named for. She had her father's wet slate hair. She had my grandmother's silver white at her temples already on the day she was born, in the small, soft place where baby's hair first comes in. The old priestess from the lower village came up to bless her. Marsa Vale held her, sitting in the warm, small room behind the council door, in the chair I had once sat in, with a fire that had been laid for both of them. And she said, looking up at me, "Wren, she is going to be loud." I laughed. I laugh more now than I ever knew a woman could laugh. The hawk voice in my chest has long since become a thing I do not have to keep account of. It comes up my throat when I want it to. It stays down when I want it to. It is not any longer a stone. It is not any longer a goose. It is, on a good morning, simply my voice, which is a kind of small, ordinary miracle the women of my line had always understood to be the truth of what we were, before the keep's councils and the keep's stewards and the keep's old drakes had decided otherwise. I will tell you one last thing, and then I will let you go. On the morning Celine was 3 weeks old, Cassian came down from the wall with snow on his shoulders and a small wooden box in his hand. He sat on the edge of our bed. He opened the box. Inside the box was the old iron cuff that had come off my wrist in the great hall on the morning of the Frostfall. He had kept it. He had not melted it down. He had not had it set into a sword's hilt or a hearthstone or a door pin. He had wrapped it in a square of linen and laid it in a small wooden box and kept it in the chest at the foot of the bed for 2 years. He said, "I do not know what to do with it. I cannot bear to keep it. I cannot bear to throw it away. Tell me, Wren." I lifted Celine against my shoulder. She was small and very warm. I touched the cuff with one fingertip. I said, "Take it down to the lower yard tomorrow. Set it in the laundry shed. Hang it from the post of the laundry line. Leave it there." He looked at me. I said in the ordinary human voice of a woman who has had her voice for 2 years and a daughter for 3 weeks and the warm weight of a mate on the edge of her bed and the long, late morning sun on her hand, "Let the next girl who walks past it know it came off." He took it down to the lower yard the next morning. He hung it on the post. It hangs there still. And that is the story of the wraith girl of the Vial Keep, who scrubbed a war room floor at dawn on the morning she had meant to murder its master, and who put a small carved bird into a council's silence at sundown, and who learned, in between, that the cuff on her wrist had been waiting 8 years for a single ordinary word in her own mouth. There was no song that saved her in the end. There was a voice. Her own, "May yours come up your throat, if it has been waiting, in its own time, and in its own ordinary, hoarse, shaking, human, miraculous way. And may the post of your own laundry line, wherever you have one, hold the iron that came off you, for the next girl who walks past it to see."